Hi, this is Leslie again, and today I would like to talk briefly about one of my recent books. It's called The Six Waves That Transformed the Religion of Peace into Political Islam or Islamism. Now, this book is available on Amazon.com, and an abridged version of it is available on the academic sites, Academia and ResearchGate. My papers are accessible on Academia under my legal name, which is Leslie Terevesi. But to access my papers on ResearchGate, please use my Muslim name, which is Abdul Karim Abdullah. Thank you. So now, what is this book about? Actually, this book was the result of some research and reading that I have done after a thought kind of crossed my mind that some time ago that something serious happened in Muslim or Islamic history that had to do with the relationship between the Quran and the Sunnah, or as I sometimes refer to these two, the revelation and tradition. It's sort of, I could say, dawned on me, you might say, that what we think of as tradition has in some ways eclipsed or obscured revelation or the Quran. And I say this because it appears that in Islamic studies, the ahadith are very often quoted more frequently than the Quran, and even the Quran has been subordinated, you might say, in some ways to the tradition, and this subordination is expressed in the saying, which is common among the jurists. The saying says that as-sunnah qadiya ala Quran, which in Arabic, in English, it means that the tradition judges the revelation. But let me get back to the main topic of this presentation, which is how this book came about as a result of this realization that somehow what we think of as tradition in Muslim history or in Islamic history sort of eclipsed the revelation, or somehow pushed the Quran into the background and took on a prominent position itself. This topic, by the way, has been investigated by other people as well. I could recommend Taha Jabir Al-Wani's book, which is available online, free of charge in PDF format. And the book is called, it was published in 2017 by IIIT, the International Institute of Islamic Thought, which is a think tank based in Herndon, Virginia, USA. And the title of this book is called Reviving the Balance. He pretty much talks about the same issue, and I find that I have many points of agreement with him. So I would also refer the viewer to this book by Taha Jabir Al-Wani. Another book worth looking into is a book written by, I believe, a friend of his, a professor of Islamic Studies, who was also the rector of the International Islamic University of Malaysia, and his name is Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman. He recently passed away, may Allah bless his soul. And also may Allah bless Taha Jabir Al-Wani's soul, who passed a few years before that, I believe in 2017. But anyway, Abu Sulaiman's book is called, was published in 2011, also by IIIT, and it is called Retrieving the Quranic Worldview. And I believe that Abu Sulaiman, argues in many ways along the similar lines as his, I believe, friend, Al-Wani, and in ways that I am also kind of pursuing and developing a little bit further, with perhaps some minor modifications. So how did this book actually arise? After I realized that something like an eclipse has transpired in the relationship between revelation and tradition, I began to think I began to kind of go both forward and backwards, if you like, to try to find out the effects of this development as well as the reasons for it. So now, going forward, I discovered a few additional, what I later termed waves, although they could also be referred to as aberrations. In other words, problematic developments in the study of Islam. And going forwards, or going backwards to the original cause of these developments, I also identified several waves or aberrations that resulted in this, this eclipse of revelation by tradition. So let me go to the beginning, and I identified altogether 6 of such waves, hence the title of the book, The 6 Waves That Transformed the Religion of Peace into Islamism. The first of these developments, which I think triggered the entire process, was what could be called the I have referred to it as the repression of reason, and in relation to tradition, for example. And the reason I have called it, the repression of reason is because of the perception by a number of the exegetes that human reason somehow was unreliable and had to give way to tradition or the hadith as an authority. In other words, that we were required to follow even the weakest hadith in spite of any sort of, how do I put this, even if it went against reason, let me put it that way. So rationality took a back seat in relation to tradition. Tradition became more authoritative than reason, and of course this is also expressed in the traditional ranking of the roots of the Sharia, where the Quran occupies the top position and is followed by tradition or the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be on him, and then is finally followed by the consensus of the scholars, and then that is followed by the ijtihad or the independent reasoning of the of the scholars, and then of course there are some additional sources or roots of the law, such as istihsan, juristic preference, considerations of public interest, and even custom. So now this repression of reason was in fact supported by tradition, which to me is, quite frankly, sounds somewhat problematic. But in any case, the tradition says that the Prophet allegedly said that anyone who uses his reason, his intellect, to interpret or explain revelation, in other words the Quran, is in fact committing an act of disbelief or kufr. So now this struck me as very problematic, because it seemed to me to prohibit the use of our reason in trying to understand revelation or the Quran. So my first question was, how can I ever understand the Quran, what the Quran is trying to teach me, if I am not going to use my reason? How can I possibly gain any understanding of the Quran if I don't use my reason? And if I cannot gain any understanding or a proper understanding of the Quran, because I'm not allowed to use my reason, I'm not likely to understand what the Quran says. Therefore, how will I be able to follow that which I cannot understand? So the prohibition of reasoning, in effect, has prevented me from doing 2 things. One was to understand the Quran, and secondly, to follow the Quran. We are advised repeatedly in the Quran by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to follow the Quran, and this we can only do, as far as I can tell, only if we understand what the Quran is teaching us. So by prohibiting reasoning in the use of reasoning or the recourse to reason in understanding the Quran, we have been in effect prevented from both understanding the Quran and from following the Quran. Now, to me, this is highly problematic. So that was the first wave that triggered 5 additional waves, and I will talk about them briefly each in the remainder of this video. Now, as a result of the prohibition of the use of reason in the understanding of revelation, it is hardly surprising that a number of readers, exegetes in particular, began to encounter verses in the Quran that struck them as either ambiguous or unclear, and even as contradictory. This is hardly a surprise, because how could you possibly understand any text without the use of reason? So the moment that I refrain from using my reason to understand any text, it should not come as a surprise that my understanding of the text begins to elude me, and that it should not come as a surprise that I will encounter passages now in the text which strike me as inconsistent and even contradictory. So this encounter of verses in the Quran which appeared to the readers, the exegetes, as ambiguous or contradictory, actually is a direct consequence, in my humble opinion, of this prohibition of the use of reason in understanding revelation. So if we want to understand revelation and we want to follow the revelation, it follows, even from the analysis we have done so far, that we need to permit our reason again to understand revelation. Unless we do that, it's not likely that we will be getting ahead and gaining any understanding of the revelation. But the process did not stop here. In response to the alleged ambiguity and of the verses of the Quran, and the ulama have turned to something else to help them understand the revelation. And this something else was, in fact, what we know as tradition, or the traditions, the prophetic traditions, or the hadith or the sunnah. We need to remember that Al-Shafi equated ahadith with the sunnah. So whenever I say I follow that understanding of the sunnah and ahadith, and so I'm using these terms here interchangeably, although a case can be made that they should not be conflated but rather kept separately. In fact, I have a separate book on that, and that book is also available on Amazon. But to come back to the topic at hand. So after calling on tradition to explain the allegedly ambiguous parts of Revelation, the exegetes realized that this was not a simple step that could be taken without another step, which was to, in fact, to elevate tradition itself, the hadith, to the same rank as the Quran, to the rank of revelation. And the reason they had to do it, or felt obliged to do this, is maybe found in 3 verses in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verses 44, 45, and 47, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that anyone who judges by something that Allah has not revealed is a kafir, a zalim, and a fasik. In other words, such a person is a disbeliever, a wrongdoer, and a rebel. So the traditions could not be used to explain the revelation, because explaining requires a degree of judgment as well. So the Quran could not be judged by the traditions or the hadith unless the hadiths themselves became revelation. So this was the reason why the ulama pretty much were, I think, compelled or obliged to elevate tradition to revelation. And the reason, I reiterate, was to enable or to qualify tradition for this task of explaining or judging revelation. So this was the this was the second wave that came about, and the result was also the results were quite problematic, because as a result of the elevation of tradition to revelation, what we have witnessed, I think, is a sort of a conflation of revelation and tradition, and I would say even a confusion between tradition and revelation. It appears that a few people or persons, including perhaps a few of the exegetes, began to somehow identify or began to experience difficulties, differentiating between the words of God and the words of man. Because revelation to Muslims, of the Quran to Muslims at any rate, is considered to be the word of God, while the traditions or the ahadith are the words or reports by human beings. So there's a massive difference between revelation and tradition. They should not be confused. So that was the second wave in a series of 6 waves. The third wave transpired when the traditions were actually elevated not only to the rank of equality with revelation, but even to a rank of superiority of revelation. And the reason for the elevation of the hadith to a rank that is actually higher than the Quran or the revelation was simply the need to use the traditions to explain or judge the revelation. And this, practice of judging the revelation in light of tradition, in fact, found an expression in a well-known saying of the exegetes. I may have mentioned it earlier. And the saying is that as-sunnah qadiya ala Quran, which means in English the tradition or the sunnah judges the Quran. So this was the third problematic development. And I say it is problematic because it appears to reverse the relationship between revelation and tradition. Now, this is also problematic from another point of view, which I have not yet mentioned, but perhaps the viewer has already thought of it. And the reason this step is problematic is because it implies that somehow tradition can be an authority that is higher than the authority of the Quran. Now that is very problematic, especially from the point of view of monotheism, or Tawheed, as we say in Arabic, because according to the teaching of the Quran, there is no authority that is higher than the authority of God. And I might add, there is no authority either that is equal to, the authority of God. Now, in terms of to just come back briefly to the second wave, in terms of the equality of the tradition and revelation, there was a hadith that was advanced to support this identification or this equality of revelation and tradition. And the hadith says that the Prophet allegedly said that I was given 2 things, the Quran and something equal to it. In other words, the hadith. Now, once again, this is very problematic because it seems to imply that the traditions somehow are equal to the Quran. It seems to imply that the words of human beings are equal to the words of God. So this is, as I said, very problematic because it seems to run counter to the teaching of monotheism. It seems to suggest that there is another authority equal to the authority of God. Now, of course, this is not admissible from the purely monotheistic point of view, but somehow this transpired. And these 2 developments, raising, first of all, the tradition to a level of equality with, raising tradition to a level of equality with revelation, and subsequently raising the authority of the tradition above revelation, both could be seen as instances of a lapse into polytheism, because in both cases the sovereignty of God was compromised, and it was compromised by alleging that there is an authority that is either equal to the authority of God or even higher than the authority of God. So in other words, these 2 developments are highly problematic from the point of view of monotheism. But interestingly, the process didn't stop there. After the tradition was raised to the level of revelation, another wave that came along was the alleged abrogation of revelation by tradition. Now, this should hardly come as a surprise, as tradition was already placed in a position where it was understood to be above revelation. But here we are seeing the process going a step further, which is actually amounts to a cancellation. The abrogation of Quranic verses by traditions actually amounts to the cancellation of the words of God by words of human beings. Another very problematic development, because once again it seems to imply that the words of human beings are able to cancel and overrule the words of God. So this is really quite astonishing how this could have transpired in the Muslim tradition in the first place. Didn't anyone object to these developments? Perhaps we need to do some additional research to see whether there was actually any dissenting voices to these highly problematic practices and turns in Islamic exegesis and jurisprudence. Just to give you a couple of examples of how the tradition abrogated revelation, we have the 2 death penalties for apostasy and adultery, neither of which has any foundation in the Quran, yet they both are traceable to some traditions according to which this practice was, or this punishment was actually prescribed and had to be included in the penal law, in Islamic law, in other words, in criminal law that constitutes a part of the Sharia. Now, there is one verse, one tradition according to which Ikrimah reported that Ibn Abbas heard the Prophet say that whoever changes his religion, kill him. That's the first tradition. That flies directly contrary to several verses in the Quran. For instance, the verse which says there is no compulsion in religion, and several other verses as well, but perhaps we can deal with this in more detail in another video. The death penalties for adultery, once again, are based on several traditions, all of which actually overrule the Quranic ruling on this issue of adultery, because the Quran specifies 100 lashes for the act of adultery, and this act of adultery has to be actually confirmed by at least 4 reliable witnesses. So I have mentioned these 2 death penalties simply as examples, perhaps the most glaring examples that we find in Islamic law of where the words of human beings actually overrule the word of God. Now, once again, this is highly problematic because, once again, like the previous 2 waves, this last wave, the doctrine of abrogation of revelation by tradition, appears to represent or be an expression of what we could call a lapse into polytheism, into suggesting that there is a higher authority that can actually overrule the words of God as expressed in the Quran. All right, so now we have looked at the several. Let's just recap what we have done so far. We have started with the first wave, that was the repression of reason. The second wave was the elevation of tradition to a level of equality with revelation. The third wave was the elevation of tradition above revelation. The fourth wave was the doctrine of abrogation. The fifth wave, perhaps I should have specified this, was the inclusion of the death penalties. Was the inclusion of the death penalties based on tradition, or let me put it more generally, the fifth wave was the inclusion of punishments in Islamic law based on tradition in cases where the tradition actually overruled revelation. So those are altogether 5 waves, and that leaves one last wave, and this one last wave I have referred to as the corruption of the meaning of military jihad as we have seen it develop in Muslim writing in the early days of Islam. The term jihad, most people will know, has 2 components. We talk about the greater jihad, which is the struggle against our own ego, and a smaller jihad, which is the so-called defensive war waged against enemies, the people who basically attack the Muslims. Now, according to the Quran, as far as the military jihad is concerned, the only kind of warfare which is permitted in the Quran is war in self-defense. And this is confirmed in a number of verses, such as verses 190 to 193 in Surah Al-Baqarah and in other verses. I would recommend a commentary of Muhammad Asad on these verses in his translation of the Quran. He similarly makes the case that the Quran allows only defensive warfare. However, what we have witnessed in Muslim exegesis and jurisprudence is that some exegetes and jurists have actually argued in favor of what has come to be called as jihad al-talab, which is aggressive jihad, and which is not a jihad, military jihad, only in self-defense, but is a form of jihad that, according to these exegetes and jurists, actually became a sixth pillar of Islam. And according to these particular commentators, this type of jihad required the Muslims who were living in the what has been called the Darul Islam, the abode of peace. This kind of jihad, this sixth pillar of Islam, required the Muslims, who are the people of the peace, this articulation of the notion of jihad required the people of the peace to wage war against the people living in the so-called Darul Harb, the abode of war. And the amazing thing is that according to these jurists, this kind of jihad was a requirement that had to be fulfilled at least once a year, and it had to be fulfilled even when, and this is the amazing part, even when the non-Muslims were not at war with the Muslims. This type of jihad was required even when the non-Muslims were not attacking the Muslims. Now, I don't know how whoever advocated this point of view arrived at it, but to me it seems extremely problematic, because even non-Muslims, and on the basis of pure rationality, people agree that we all have a right to defend ourselves. But to go and attack someone who is not attacking me, I mean, that is just beyond reason, that is beyond rationality, and it is definitely beyond the teaching of the Quran. So I think we have some work to do here, and we need to relook at not just this very problematic articulation of the doctrine of military jihad, the so-called aggressive jihad, but we need to look at all of the previous waves, which I have mentioned earlier, and reevaluate the entire system of thought and the methodology used in arriving at these conclusions, because as long as we leave this task unattended, the misconceptions about Islam will continue to proliferate, and that is not going to do any good to anyone, including and in particular the Muslim community. I would just like to conclude by adding one person's name who apparently among the contemporary scholars still continue to hold on to this doctrine of aggressive jihad, and that was an alim by the name of Sayyid Ramadan al-Bouti, who maintained that even until this day, this doctrine of aggressive jihad still applies, and this is very problematic. That even contemporary ulama, some of them are still holding on to this, I believe, highly distorted and even corrupted understanding of the notion of military jihad. So I think with that, I would like to conclude this little presentation. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please write them into the comments below, and I will do what I can in order to address them, plus any additional concerns that you may have. Thank you. That's all for now. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.